all. Nice to have you all here. Seeing people in person. My name is John Pierre Losson. I am the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies here at the Graduate Center. I returned to the Graduate Center after a long absence and just came back in July. And I can't think of a better way to launch my second public life at the Graduate Center than by being here today to help launch Pierre Losson's new book. I'm not going to take up a lot of your time except to say that the center really appreciates the opportunity to celebrate the book of Graduate Center alums, and very happy that you decided to join us today. I'm going to hand off the responsibilities of running today's program to my colleague, Susan Woodward. Susan is a professor of political science at the Graduate Center here at CUNY, a specialist on the Balkans. Her research focuses on transitions from civil war to peace, international security and state failure, and post-war statehood. He was a member of the United Nations Committee on Experts on Public Administration between 2010 and 2014, a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution between 1990 and 1999, and then at the Center for Defense Studies at King's College London between 1990 and 2000, before coming to the Graduate Center in 2021. She has taught at Yale and Northwestern universities and Brookings College. Her many writings include The Ideology of Failed States, Why Intervention Fails, both Facts of Chaos and Institution of the Cold War, and finally the sort of poison the political conflict in public university press, where she currently serves groups. I'm glad to hand the floor over to her and hear this wonderful program. Thank you all for coming.
We're here to celebrate the meeting that long. So really wonderful. Welcome, everyone. I have the great pleasure of having this task of introducing wonderful former students. Some of you are faculty in the CUNY system and know that this is the example of privilege of teaching. This is the book. Some of you may know this. Return.
We should stand it up. One that isn't full of little post-it notes.
Latin America, nationalism, policy, and politics in Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Let me just say thank you very much to the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies for hosting this. And I will tell you again, but we will be having a reception afterwards downstairs. I'll wait to tell you the logistics that once we finish. But I wanted to say, just first of all, let me tell you about Pierre, and then so Pierre Losson worked in French cultural centers in Mexico City and Lima. Lima was a very important part of this story that I speak for. He did that for 10 years. His research focuses on cultural policy in Latin America and the restitution and returns of cultural heritage objects to their country of origin, up for this book. He has published articles in journals such as International Journal of Cultural Policy, Journal of Arts Management, Law and Society, International Journal of Heritage Studies, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, among others. He graduated in International Relations from the Institut de Politiques in Strasbourg, has master's degrees in both in arts administration from the University of Lyon and Latin American and Colombian studies from Florida International University, and his Ph.D. In the fall of 2020, he was a post-doctoral fellow at Columbia University's Italian Academy. This is a very prestigious place and a very competitive postdoctoral fellowship. And I was very pleased when Pierre received that. And I'm hoping at some point, if not in this talk, but maybe perhaps in a discussion, he might tell us about the exhibition that he created while he was at the Italian Academy on the Benin rock bronzes. It was utterly fascinating. I think you might still want to go to YouTube and watch it for the Italian Academy. Pierre is also now the director of institutional engagement at the American Society. We thought it would be nice to start off with a treat. So Pierre is going to show you slides with some of the beautiful objects about which he's writing, and then we will switch to the discussion. Yeah.
So much to thank you for your time. I wasn't sure that all of you would have read the book or be familiar with the stories, Golden stories that I'm using for what I wrote this book. And so I thought I would use a little bit of our time to tell you about those. You may be familiar with some of them if that's a topic that I'm looking to do. I do not know how to start. I studied in 3 countries. India and Mexico, I used 2 case studies for each country that I did research in that. And there is one commonality among all these cases is that they are what I call they are really what I call pieces of interest, meaning that the objects that are claimed cannot be returned to their country of origin based on existing text of international or national law. So that's where the politics come in, and that's how I got interested into why the country brought these objects back and why the museums would agree or not to return back. So I'll start with Peru. It might be the case that you have heard about. It concerns a collection of artifacts from Machu Picchu. They were excavated in the 1910s, right after the discovery, and I'm using here huge quotation mark around discovery because locals always knew that there was the ruins of an old city over there, but the discovery of Machu Picchu for the world, the Peruvian government has labeled it, by an American archaeologist, Aaron Lincoln, who had been sponsored by Yale University and the National Geographic Society. It made quite a splash at the time, with beautiful pictures in black and white of the city. He conducted the first scientific excavations of Machu Picchu, found hundreds of objects, and obtained a decree from the Peruvian government at the time to take these objects back to Yale with him for further study. The decree, however, specified that he had to return these objects 18 months later. He obtained an extension of the loan, arguing that he had been here during World War I, he was sick, those extensions were granted. But the Peruvian government actually asked for the return in the early 1920s. And then the memory of the collection seemed to have faded a little bit, even though there were always people, particularly in Cusco, who still knew about this collection and even visited it as well. But there was really no political incentive to make a big fuss about it and to fight for its return until the late 1990s. And I think a lot is owed to a lady in Lima, who's called Mariana. She is the widow of a very famous Peruvian historian, and she kind of made it the mission of her life to investigate the collection. And she's the one who really found many of the documents that later supported the Peruvian. Soon enough, politics got into the game because Alejandro Toledo, who was the first
elected Colombian president at the return of democracy in Peru, were an interest in this question. He and his wife, an anthropologist, and they really made this a state affair. They were not able to secure the return before the end of their term in power. So Alan Garcia, who was elected in 2006, continued that fight. And the fight really got really bitter with the university. And there really was like the media and international pressure on the university to return the collection, which they finally agreed to do at the end of 2010. And the collection is now housed in Cusco, in a house that belongs to the National University there. And in an interesting twist of the story is that the curator of the collections there are still the people who are in charge of the collection at the end. So they haven't lost everything in the trend. But suddenly the history concerns a collection of Paracas textiles. Paracas is a Colombian culture that is run south of Lima in a coastal desert. These textiles were used to bury mummies, and because it is, they were found in very dry conditions, they were found in excellent conditions. They started appearing on markets in Lima in the 1920s. That's why you can find collections of these textiles, for example, at the Brooklyn Museum or at the American Museum of Repatriation. And in that case, the Swedish consul in Lima bought some of those textiles and took them with him back to Sweden, gave them to the Museum of Gothenburg, where they stayed until the 2000s. There, the story is a little different. As the museum became the Museum of World Culture, the curators really adopted a different approach to their collections and organized an exhibition called The Stolen World. Well, basically, they were acknowledging that these textiles had at some point been stolen. All this happening around 2008, that means like really at the height of those fights with Yale over the Mexico collection. So that really sparked an interest in also asking for the return of this collection. Politically, it was much less complicated. The mayor of the city of Gothenburg, which owns the museum, quickly agreed to that return. But then it took several years of negotiations over technical issues to agree on how the collection would be returned. By everyone's admission, the conditions of the textiles were being kept in Sweden were excellent. And we had quite a sketchy record to compare with materials. So several years of negotiations to make sure that the textiles would be returned in proper conditions. And they are now in the collections of the newly inaugurated museum, which is south of Lima in the south of the coast. Moving on to Mexico, this is another piece that you may have heard of. Is the Repatriation of Moctezuma, or Moctezuma's headdress. It's Moctezuma's probably only name. We know quite little about the beautiful Canadian feathers. It may have been made to wear on the head, but that is not entirely sure. And we also do not really know why or how the object left Mexico for Europe in the 16th century. So that was really a long time ago. For a very long time, the museum in Vienna argued that it had been a gift from Moctezuma directly to the Emperor Charles V. Only that this has never been proved, so there are other theories that may have been ransacked in Moctezuma's palace, or it may have been stolen. We don't really know, and for that matter, we don't really know with Moctezuma's. It may have been like an object of ceremonies for priests rather than really with the power over them. There always, there has been an interest in Mexico for this object for a long time. That's in the 1930s. The Mexican government, following the Mexican Revolution, trying to foster a greater sense of national unity and celebrating the Colombian past of the country in order to the copy to be made. So here is some of that. File is the original in Vienna, and on the right side is the copy that is in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Again, not much political pressure for its return until the 1980s, where two citizen initiatives combined. One found an Aztec dancer, and I'm sorry that I'm using a lot of quotation marks here, but someone claiming to perform traditional Aztec dances and arguing that he speaks on behalf of indigenous community in Mexico, started organizing protests and marches in European capitals, and particularly in Vienna, where he would stage dances, and that really attracted the attention of the media. We're talking here about the mid-1950s. And at the same time, in Mexico, a descendant of the self-proclaimed descendant of Moctezuma, which might be true because Moctezuma had many children, who also started lobbying Mexican authorities to act and claim the objects, which they started doing in the 1990s. Many political ups and downs and changes of governments in all these stories since then. The current state of affairs is that the binational tradition in 2012, the rule that the object, the original one, is to be moved. So that's the argument to even discuss the possibility of returning this object to Mexico. Mexican pieces is quite different. Neural thresholds that were found that were limited in the Chihuahua, which is a very important archaeological site north of Mexico City. They were needed during the 1960s at a time when excavations were taking place, a road was being constructed, so that explains why the leaders may have been able to conduct their activities without being noticed. They were purchased by an American citizen who brought them with him back to the States. And upon his death in the late 1970s, he requested the frescoes to the Lyon Museum in San Francisco. The judge confirmed that the museum had a title to the frescoes because the objects had been imported before 1970, which is the date of the Universal Convention and of the bilateral U.S.-Mexico Treaty on the matter. But the museum contacted Mexican authorities. They had no expertise in taking care of this object. Negotiation ensued, and in the mid-1980s, the museum agreed to return half the collection to Mexico, which by today's standard would probably be a weird solution, but at the time certainly generated some goodwill, and the museum has been collaborating with Mexican authorities since then on several exhibition and research projects. Sorry, long, but Colombia. The first piece is that the Cambodia collection. It's a collection of 122 objects in gold that were found in 1890 in what is now the Coffee region in Colombia. At the time, most objects in gold were being melted because their material was more important than their historical or anthropological significance. However, these objects were so beautiful that the people who found them took them to the few collectors, the few Colombian collectors of it. They purchased it, and then in turn, the following year, Colombia was trying to organize its participation to a Hispanic American exhibition taking place in Madrid in 1892. That was important for Colombia because of the political turmoil of the time, had not been able to participate in the 1890 Paris Universal Exhibition. So they really wanted to have an activity. The president ordered the purchase of the collection, sent it to Madrid for exhibition of the exhibition, and the following year, when the exhibition closed, he gifted it to the Queen of Spain. Fast forward a century later, again, two citizen initiatives, one in the Conflict region and another one in Bogotá, are pushing for the Colombian government to ask for this return from Madrid, with the argument that these objects are too important and should be in Colombia, but also with the legal argument that objects purchased with public funds at the time, according to the 1886 Colombian Constitution, should not have been gifted. So that the gift was the Constitutional Court of Colombia actually agreed with that and asked the government to start negotiations with the Spanish government over the return of the connection. 5 years later, there is a commission that is meeting in all cities. Honestly, no one has been able to tell me if there ever was in the past or what is the negotiations are. And I'll finish with this piece. I'll finish with this one because that might be the one that may have some developments in the near future. 25 statues from San Agustin, it's an archaeological site inside of Colombia. They were taken by German archaeologists without any form of authorization in the 1910s. And have been since kept in the Museum of Technology in Roldan. Here again, a citizen initiative in the town of San Agustin, European American citizens who have been living there for a long time, have been pushing and asking the Colombian authorities to act and ask for the return of the statues. Not much has happened because, again, very little political will in Colombia to ask for return, but the changes are really coming from Germany. Germany has been at the forefront these past 2 or 3 years of the wave of claims, particularly on the Benin bronzes, for example. The archaeological museum has been absorbed in a larger institution called the Humboldt Farm that was very much under criticism when it opened. For example, from Benedict Savoy, who was commissioned by the French President Macron to write a report about the collection of science. And she was in the scientific committee of the Humboldt Forum, from which she resigned, arguing that the approach of the new forum was too conservative and not ready to examine the origin of its collection. That is really changing, and I'm hearing that there would be negotiations between German and Colombian authorities. I know that these negotiations are over other objects, may concern these statues as well. And my question and concern right now is what will, if statues are returned, what will happen to the local community? They are really the ones who wanted this return. And I can totally imagine the situation in which statues would return and without any kind of legal I took on. Thank you very much.
That's fine, that's fine. So you will have an opportunity to hear Pierre again after our discussion. We're going to return to it. I now turn to the first of our discussants, Professor Mary Roldan. She is the Dorothy Epstein Professor of Latin American History at London College and University of Graduate Student. Her publications include, it would take half an hour to just list them, so I will use her official bio here just to shorten them. But they include Blood and Fire, La Violencia in Antioquia, Colombia, which was the winner, this is important, of the 2003 Fundación Alejandra Angel Escobar Prize in the social sciences. Very nice. And then a new book from 2017, Radio Sutatenza, now I'm going to say cultural revolution. Her research interests and publications include the mid-century Colombian conflict known as La Violencia, the impact of drug trafficking on urban society and policy in Medellin, paramilitary organizations, grassroots peace initiatives, radio, and Catholic transnational mass media literacy and development projects during the Cold War. She has just finished a co-edited volume on the golden era of radio, that's the 1940s to the 50s in Latin America, and another one which is being translated, I think she looks like. We look forward very much to Professor Mary Roldan's. Is that right?
No, I'd be fine right here. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
I'll project my voice. How's that? Well, it gives me extraordinary, thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. And it gives me great pleasure, actually, to be here. And first I want to start with a little anecdote of how a historian came to be on Pierre's committee, and it was the GC. I taught a course called Media, Politics, and the Public Sphere. And it turned out, unbeknownst to me, but in the end, fabulous thing, that it was open to MAL students, to students in anthropology, geography, political science, art history. And that course had about 15 people in it. And it was fabulous fun. And Pierre was one of those individuals. And at one point, I believe that the genesis of this book, which first started out as a dissertation, was broached to me and whether I would be a member of his committee on a bench in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it's actually really appropriate. It all kind of fits in. And at first, I have to confess, and this is actually seminal to or directly related to some of my comments, that I was skeptical. I thought, okay, exactly how is this argument going to be made? And it seemed at first like it was more about sort of the legalities of it, that is the differentiation or the differences between repatriation, for instance, which is a concept, return claims, the kinds of disputes that have emerged, for instance, among Jewish families who had their art stolen by the Nazis and have been clamoring to have it restored or for them to be restituted. And in fact, and I didn't really know how much of this could really translate into a political science dissertation, but I was wrong. And it was an incredibly rich dissertation, and this is a very rich book. And it's one of the things I wanted to start with was that many of us read these articles in the New York Times, and just recently they've been much in the news. Of disputes on the global stage in which a major museum, for instance, as recently happened with the Met and the Getty Museum and the British libraries, for instance, and the ongoing one with the Elgin Marbles and Merlina Mercucci, who was the Minister of Culture in Greece, who really might have started the kind of media fanfare about or awareness of these disputed kinds of central to national patrimony cultural objects. And they often involved, it often takes, a very similar kind of framework. The entity that holds these items is not the place of origin of the items. They're accused of exhibiting it as part of their collections, and in many cases, it making their kind of reputation and attracting tourists and being one of the central reasons why people go to these museums. And yet they're disputed either because they're illicitly trafficked. Just recently, it's the whole working with actually the equivalent of a guaquero, but in Cambodia, for instance, of identifying all of these materials that are in the Met and other museums, and that in fact were looted, systematically looted and trafficked and smuggled. Or they might have formed part of colonial plunder, or have dubious provenance, say from a donor, that obscures the fact that they were taken from the places where they were produced under questionable circumstances, and should now, as the governments who Pierre lays out very clearly in the book, have to be the entity that makes these claims, right? It can't just be an individual, it can't be a community, it has to be an official government that makes these return claims, even if it's not the government that was initially most interested in requesting that claim. It might be in the Cambodia case, for instance, it could be local anthropologists and lawyers and community members in a place like Quindío and not the state, or in the case of the San Agustin, it could be also the locality of San Agustin in the case of Dellenbach, the American citizen who's kind of been leading this. But the point is that these governments will argue that they need to be returned because they represent an invaluable aspect of cultural legacy or patrimony that's central to national identity, right? And so it's kind of like a wound that hasn't healed, and that by continuing to be located in the place other than where it should be and where its meaning isn't fully understood. This is often brought up very much with the ways in which, for instance, cultural objects that have deep religious or ancestral meaning in any range of museums. The Met has a huge collection, and I happen to love going to see them, but nonetheless, that they exhibiting them in that takes them out of their context and is a violation in many ways of the very deep cosmological, personal, and cultural identification and connection that the people who produce them feel for them. And it's like a rape, right? I mean, it's like a violation. Now, these cases typically drag on for decades. They often find no resolution. And aside from the fact that they make great media fodder and they'll, be reproduced in newspapers and magazines and in TV programs even, because of the lurid details that typically surround these forms of cultural appropriation and neocolonial oppression, they're often associated or represented as a one-way street. It's typically a wealthier, more powerful first world kind of country that holds these objects, and those who make these claim requests are typically what used to be called a third world, or a less developed, or a poorer, and certainly less politically powerful entity. So it kind of reproduces that uneven power relationship in which the countries that have produced, on whose current territory, and that's one of the complexities that is discussed in this book. A people produced an object of enormous value, artistically, religiously, etc., is forced into a position of having to beg a former colonial power, in the case of Spain, for instance, and Colombia, to return what they feel is rightfully theirs. And it often ends up, the outcome is might makes right. This is certainly what the conclusion is with something with the Elgin marbles. They're not going anywhere. And in part, it's Britain's it was plunder. At the time, there was not the place that, Greece didn't exist as an independent entity. All's fair in love and war. And it was a long time ago. And why do you want these objects now? Now, you might think that this is all pretty straightforward. And what is, I think, really wonderful about this book is that Pierre very systematically and elegantly unpacks for us how it is anything but straightforward. So there are these 6 case studies. My own specialty is Colombia, so I'll probably focus more on that than on Mexico and Peru. But I want to underline something that he says at the end in his conclusion, because as a historian, one of the most valuable insights from this book is that in unpacking the timing of when these claims are made, who initiates them, the actual civil actors in society, as opposed to the governments who have to legally perform this act, but aren't necessarily the ones who initiate it. And the precise domestic political circumstances, and also sometimes the larger global circumstances in which these claims are made, tells us an enormous amount that goes way beyond either the history of the objects themselves or the history of unequal relationships and power dynamics between the country that requests these returns and the country that holds these objects. As he says, and I quote, "Constructed as heritage, objects from the past continue to tell us as much about our present," end of quote. And the study of their return back toward their country of origin can reveal as much about the institutions and societies that currently hold them as about the countries where they were produced. And this, for me, is one of the richest insights in this particular book. In addition, because we have limited time and there are other discussants, an entry point that I find really fascinating in Pierre's work, and that is where he argues that the idea of nationalism is a performance. And these return claims often are one of the central performances that particular states or governments undertake for a variety of reasons. And that's why this case study approach, as opposed to the idea that there's one size fits all and they all follow the same dynamic, which Pierre very, I think, persuasively refutes. This case study approach embedded in what we might call Clifford Geertz's very thick observation and analysis, where he really takes apart what is going on in the domestic politics of these countries around these objects, can illuminate for us the fact that in a larger sense, it's not really about the cultural objects themselves at all. It's really about asserting and projecting a certain vision of the nation. Now, the interesting thing in that purports to represent collective identities and a sense of collective value of what the central values of these societies might be. All 6 of these cases involve indigenous items, but they're all quite different in the sense that, and here I'm gonna just briefly speak about the Colombian case. The Colombian case is usually the odd man out. So almost literally man. In the Mexican case, while it may not be the case that the Mexican government is always gung-ho about initiating these return claims, as Pierre notes, there is a long contested, but nonetheless very real discourse and reality around indigenismo and the value that being able, particularly in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, to ground claims about Mexican sovereignty and Mexican national identity were embedded in being able to invoke a genealogical connection that went all the way back to the Aztecs or the Maya, right? And that gave a kind of ballast, if you will, to those claims of national sovereignty and to that construction of a state that represented all Mexicans as a kind of mestizo identity, in which the celebration and cultural value of these products formed a critical point of cohesion, if you will, in society. Now, it didn't change the circumstances of most of the indigenous people who were only in a distant way related to the groups that might have produced something like Montezuma's headdress. But that fiction, as Ben Anderson refers to it in Imagined Communities, was nonetheless very powerful, and it allowed people to make claims based on this national discourse about what it meant to be Mexican and what that stood for. There wasn't anything comparable. Peru's is a much more complicated case, but in the Colombian case, even though there was a bit of indigenismo, the reality is that that national projection of identity was never at the executive level or at the level of a central government in Bogota ever framed in those kind of indigenous terms. And that's important because what Pierre shows is that there's been, and he's very polite about this, he'll use words like the Colombian government was coy or cautious or reluctant, it doesn't even say reluctant. It's all very, very diplomatic, when the reality is that, in fact, it was uninterested. In almost all of these cases, it made no effort, and to the degree that it was forced to make an effort, it was because something like the Constitutional Court found in favor of the claimants that were based in Quindío that this should be brought back. And what it actually reveals, and I think this is very true in the Colombian case, is the emergent and deep-seated resentment at the liberties taken by a certain sector of society that has historically wielded power, and certainly the executive office in Colombia. So that something like what happened with the Quimbaya collection is about a betrayal, right? It is about how did the government sell out Colombia by giving away this extraordinarily valuable and beautiful collection. And as Pierre points out, the problem with this is that it was freely given away, right? There's not an enormous amount of legal basis for being able to claim it back, which is one of the things that the Colombian government purports and says, how do we ask them to give it back? We gave it to them. It was maybe inappropriate, but there's nothing that we can do about it. It wasn't smuggled out of the country. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't, illegally transported by a collector. No, it was actually given by the national government. But it points to also the fact that in this particular case, and I'm going to conclude, as Pierre points out in a very important insight, how national governments handle these return claims tells us a lot about who they prioritize in societies, and also who they feel in a competition between competing claims really merits more of their attention or investment. And in this particular case, aligning themselves, and this is where domestic politics, and by that I mean specifically the moment, the historical moment in which these claims are initiated, who's in power, and what is going on in the country as a whole makes an enormous difference. Having Spain as an ally at a moment in which, as many of us who are historians of Latin America recognize, the second Reconquista happened, sometime in the late 1990s, early aughts, in which Spain began to buy publishing houses, to invest and establish banks, to have a much greater sort of reasserting its kind of old colonial presence in these countries, at a moment in which a country like Colombia was still involved, and continues to be, in a longstanding and very violent civil conflict. And here, to finish, the San Agustin is located in a particularly important area because it's Huila. And Huila, which is in the southern part of Colombia, was, during La Violencia, especially in the 1950s, one of the most severely affected areas by violence, the area where many of the leftist guerrillas, particularly the FARC, will relocate. And for decades, not a place, not only because it's in the middle of nowhere and it takes a long time to get there, even if you're in Garzón and you want to travel to San Agustin, Garzón being a major city in Huila, it's because you couldn't actually go there, right? The politics of it were such that it would take a long time to discover or even be able to push for returning an object like these statues. But also in the larger scheme of things, it paled in comparison to the very real needs and restricted political and social and economic conditions in which the individuals trapped in this landscape lived. So to conclude, this is really a much more than about what we might think, just return claims. It's really an entry point, I think, into the fascinating cultural, political, and economic complexities and the global relationships that have defined Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, channeled through these particular, the disputes, if you will, over these particular cultural objects. And I'll just
I had while listening to Professor Roldan, I wish I had been in that course.
it was a fun course when we watched telenovelas too.
We now turn to Professor Aaron Thompson, who is America's only professor of art crime, as Associate Professor of Fraud, Forensic, Art Law, and Crime in the Department of Art and Music at John Jay College, City University of New York. She studies the black market for looted antiquities, art forgery, museum theft, the ethics of digital reproductions of cultural heritage, art made by detainees at Guantanamo Bay, even, among other topics. She is also a member of the advisory committee for the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign. Her latest book this year, 2022, called Smashing Statues, The Rise and Fall of America's Public Monuments, traces the turbulent history and abundant ironies of our monuments. She has written and spoken about the science of public art, the history of protests, the legal barriers to removal of controversial art, and examples of innovative approaches to the problem in venues including Art in America, Smithsonian Magazine, the New York Times. She's recently been interviewed in the New Yorker, and 3 days ago, John Oliver cited her, and she now has 27,000 Facebook followers.
Twitter, not Facebook.
Facebook is old hat.
I apologize.
Pierre contacted me more or less out of the blue and asked if I wanted to be on his committee. And I said, yes, of course, because I was curious, always good to follow curiosity, because I had for a long time not understood why there isn't more protest about pre-Columbian objects in American museums. I use that with, the air quotes of all the problematics of that term, but because they became fashionable to collect in the US in the 60s, the 70s, well after being illegal to export from countries of origin. And they just kind of sit there, and there's a lot of growing public debate about the Benin bronzes, Greek and Roman objects. Now Cambodia is in the mix. This John Oliver segment a couple of days ago, I highly recommend. It's on YouTube, very funny. Especially the end when they do a sketch about the Payback Museum, stolen American heritage. It's very good. But it mentions all of these different categories of objects, but not objects from South and Central America. And I didn't understand why there's not more outcry about these when it seems a pretty clear-cut case. And your research really helped explain to me the complexities of this situation, and has been, and I think should be influential for anyone who is interested in either histories of repatriation or ongoing repatriation claims and campaigns. Because what Pierre's work demonstrates is that something I am coming to believe more and more intensely is that cultural heritage law doesn't matter. So I'm a lawyer, but still, everybody thinks, oh, you just have to know the law and then repatriation will either happen or not. But that is never the case. First of all, what law are you talking about? Is it the law of the source country, the law of the market country, international treaties? And then even if you have a country whose laws you're paying attention to, is it specific cultural heritage law or law relating to stolen property in general, one of which is much more favorable to possessors currently? And then once you have that choice of law, will you find a prosecutor who is willing to apply that law, which is much harder than you might think. So the Manhattan DA's office, very, very interested in prosecuting those who are holding stolen cultural property. In much of the rest of the country, it is very low down on the priority list. In part because there's a lack of expertise, a lack of urgency, a lack of success, et cetera. So understanding how repatriation campaigns succeed or fail based not just on, is there an applicable law, is there legal evidence, but on the whole structure, both of the community, the country, the political situation, making the claim, and those receiving the claim is very important to do. And has helped me advise in Nepal and other countries, what do you do when your government is, reluctant? What are the reasons for that reluctance? Can they be turned around? What are the incentives to offer, and et cetera? So Pierre did this marvelous job, not just analyzing the structure in a theoretical way, but also looking at the surface, I would say, by looking at how are these claims reported on in local newspapers? What do people say they want? And what can you analyze, like, do they really want? But both levels are important when you're making claims. And I would, let's see, what else do I have to add? And yeah, I won't take up too much time because I'd rather have some discussion, but I think that this type of rigorous research is exactly what is needed to have successful repatriation campaigns, both in the forming of the campaigns and in the reacting to the campaigns. So I hope many people will read this wonderful book.
Now I'm changing status, so I'm going to sit. So when Pierre began this project, it really was, as I slightly mentioned at the beginning, his own experience as a cultural attaché in Lima for France, and noticed the discussion. And at the time was very, when was this, maybe 7 years ago? How, right? I should have looked it up. 7, yeah. There was really not very much, other than the Elgin marbles, which Professor Roldan has already mentioned, and we all hear about on occasion. There really was not very much discussion about this all in the public, certainly, but even in the academic environment. In his book, the dissertation now book, he argues that in the countries he's looking at, it's about 30 years that this discussion has begun. But I would like to emphasize that it's even actually just in the last couple of years that I think this whole topic has begun to explode. And so to notice that you are now reading one of the original proponents of thinking about this. Secondly, when Pierre began by observing debates in Peru, it was only by asking, and this is now the political science part, I think, I hope, by asking about the comparison, the comparative cases. So not just to look at Peru, but to find other places in Latin America, controlling a bit for culture perhaps, but to find others to see what the differences are. And one of the things that's really quite fascinating to me is what the book shows is how contested the concept of nationalism is in each of these cases, and that he reveals and discovers through the debates among the various actors, experts, the state, professionals, and civil society, who are at home within these countries, thinking about whether to make claims and how to make them, and simultaneously, how much variation there is within what, let's call it, the international community, but basically the countries that are the holding institutions. You can probably see, I suspect, even by reading the New York Times daily, of how to compare the way France and Germany have been dealing with the return of the Benin bronzes to Nigeria and to Benin on the one hand, and the way continuing refusal, as Professor Roldan has already mentioned, by Britain to return the Elgin marbles that are in the British Museum to Greece. And we are, of course, in the middle of the Hellenic Observatory at the London School of Economics is just having next Monday a new session on the efforts by Greece to get these back. So this is not an old story, it's a continuing one. So it's back. So I just wanted to mention a few issues that I found fascinating and would love Pierre to respond to any of them, more not as questions, but more as illustration. One, how much, and this may be more about Latin America because of the importance of indigenous peoples, but how much the relationship between race and culture is an important part of this story. It was my surprise, and I suspect, Pierre, if you remember, whether you were also surprised that the indigenous peoples, after all, it's their culture that is being appropriated by the government in its definition of nationalism and its claims, and its particular concept of the nation, that is the whole story in this book. But it's the indigenous don't seem to be very interested in this. And so I hope you can expand. I would even notice if, for example, at Columbia University next week, there's a special lectureship, and this is a specialist on Du Bois, the American Black scholar and activist, that it turns out Du Bois at a certain point in his work turned to culture itself as a way of fighting racism. So this sort of link, I think, it's certainly important in the Latin American case. I was hearing more about this in terms of Venezuela today, but it's also important in this country. The second piece that I would like him to talk about is the aspect of imperialism or colonialism. Professor Roldan has also mentioned this, that I think we don't know much about, or certainly don't suspect. That is to say that the justification itself that Pierre discovers by the holding institutions, mainly museums, but not only, the justification given for not returning is just a repeat of the racism of late 19th century colonialism and the discussion of the way we know the scientific community was talking about race at the time. There doesn't seem to be, and the idea that these people to whom they would be returned are not capable of keeping these safe. The issue of care comes up. To me, it was quite appalling, but it's a very important part of this political story. Third, and now is sort of the question, in the sort of very recent, in my awareness, only in the last year or so, how many Native American claims are being made for returns of various, either culture or land that has the symbolic cultural value. And I'm curious about whether, when you now have claims by people within a country against their own state, how your book can help us think through that issue. I want to repeat the distinction Professor Roldan and made that Pierre makes in the book between returns on the one hand and repatriation on the other. You might want to elaborate. You mentioned that, but I think that's very interesting. Finally, one of the questions that Pierre asks himself is, what makes for a successful claim? That is to say, a successful either return or repatriation. And he finds in this comparative study that what's essential are political entrepreneurs. It may not be who the political entrepreneurs are, although they are, as he says, mainly civil society actors in these three cases. But without the political entrepreneur, you will never get so. So let me just say two more things. One of the absolute delights for me as the main advisor for this dissertation was how beautifully Pierre writes. And you'll find that in my invitation to read the book itself, not only to hear us today, but to say you have a treat in store for reading. And finally, if you want to tell us about the op-ed piece in Le Monde in May, I think we'd all be very interested. Thanks, Pierre.
So to try and address each of your comments, you're right. I think that for me, the lack of interest that I felt in all three countries from indigenous actors for these objects was really a surprise. And here I want to be cautious. I did not do ethnological work, so I did not spend a few months with communities to take the time to talk this through. And so that might be the limitation to my comment right now. However, I think that for me really spoke to how an object, once it has been disconnected from its original context for a long time, just loses its meaning. Hence the fact that not every object is of interest to every country everywhere in the world. One fascinating thing about doing a PhD is that, for example, you take a class with Mary Roldan and she tells you about people like Marisol de la Cadena, who writes books about what it is to be indigenous in Peru, and so what the word means and how race or culture can enter into the self-definition of indigenousness, no? So you get to read about all these kind of things. So do PhDs if you want to do that. That's really great. But then it really adds layers to how you try and think about this, because if I look at Mexico, the actors who claim to be indigenous are not necessarily acknowledged by quote unquote real indigenous communities as being indigenous themselves. And for example, the Mexican government, that I saw in the official documents that I saw, denies them the indigeneity that they pretend to have. And what I heard I think in all three countries is that there is not necessarily an interest in these specific objects, because indigenous communities may have interest in other objects, may have interest in living forms of heritage more than objects that for them are in a way dead, but also have lost interest in these objects because they do recognize to the national state the legitimacy to claim these objects. they do not want these objects back in their own village for their own use. As, for example, is something that we see a lot, I think, here in Native American communities. I'm not saying that this does not exist in Latin America, but at least not with these objects that I was studying. And I think here an important difference is to be made also with human remains. I'm studying cultural objects, and I think that there is because even in Latin America, even though not everywhere, but particularly in the Southern Cone, in Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, there is much interest for the repatriation of human remains and those to be reburied in their community of origin, which is not something that is so common in actually the 3 countries that I studied. But I think that this is an important difference. The reasons for not returning. I think I agree with your characterization, even though in the past 2, 3, 5 years, I think we hear, at least in discourse, a change in the attitude of many museums. Again, more in certain countries than in others. I think Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium are probably the countries that are going farther at the moment in the direction of really re-examining the colonial origins of the collections of their public museums and making concrete steps to repair some of the, when it is possible, some of these situations. There is clearly much more reluctance in the UK, and yes, I do believe that is in great part linked to the fate of the marbles, but not only. And I think that the whole debate about the Benin bronzes has really shown that. Germany has announced that all public museums in Germany will return the bronzes they have in their collections, while in the UK, it's mostly smaller university museums who have made similar decisions, while the British Museum, for example, still retrenches behind the legal details of to for now claim that the museum is not at liberty to make this decision. Native claims in the US, I think I touched a little bit on this. I really think that the relationship that the US as a nation has with its native nations is very different in that sense, which has led to the passing of laws such as the North American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990. So that's already like over 30 years ago, especially for human remains. If I were to be cynical, I would say that maybe we can make restitutions of human remains so that we don't talk too much about land and other concerns. Maybe that's too cynical because it's probably a good first step to at least be acknowledging that there's really not much point in having the bones of ancestors stored somewhere in a warehouse in a museum, and those bones could just be in the land where the people lived. So I definitely think that the approach here is very different. An anecdote for me was that, especially I remember having this conversation in Peru with several people where people were saying, oh, but look, in the US, museums give back to Native communities. So by the application of NACPRA, Yale should give us the Machu Picchu collection back. And I was like, no, that's not the way it works. It's quite specifically for human remains, and it's quite specifically for the domestic situation in the US. So NACPRA does not apply to your case. But I guess what it showed is that the US situation had really created a consciousness in the region that this kind of movement is possible if it were to be desired. which again is in some countries more than in others in the region, I think. Oh, Le Monde. Yeah, so that was, I think the book exists in great part because, well, the dissertation, of course, but also thanks to the fellowship at the Italian Academy, because that gave me time to like rework the manuscript. And during that time, I also offered to organize a conference on the Benin bronzes, because that was really developing at the time. And with a colleague in Paris, we wrote an op-ed for Le Monde where we were encourages French museums to be a little more transparent, first as to what it is that they have in their collections, and then to maybe be a little more proactive and just just don't wait to be shamed publicly until you make the move. I realized how very little influence that I have in this world, because I don't think that that op-ed was followed by any effect at all, but at least it's out there.
And at least Le Monde was very.
Yeah, they were definitely interested in the topic.
Great. So now I'm going back to my other status. And ask people to make comments and ask questions. Who would like to start? Yes. Wouldn't mind telling who you are.
I'm Professor Ramirez, from CUNY. I have a question regarding the historical Baja question. The latest communication from the Spanish government to the Academia, to the Academia de Historia del Quindío, which is the local people claiming the Tesoro Quimbaya, was that is the Tesoro Quimbaya is Patrimonio Español, belongs to the Spanish patrimony. That means belongs to the crown. So my comment is that I am from Armenia, Quindío. I know very well the case. I wrote about it. And I know that I don't think Spain will ever return even a finger of these pieces to Colombia. Never, ever. So knowing that, and because there is a new government, Petro, do you think that Petro will start the discussion? I know that this is politics, but everything is politics too in this case. So it's a question for the two of you that you know very well the case.
I asked myself that same question, actually, as I was rereading the book and thinking about what difference it might make that Petro's government, and I actually made a list of all the individuals of indigenous descent that he's appointed in various very important offices. So for instance, the permanent representative to the UN is an Arahuaco woman leader who's been very involved in social movements and has been appointed to commissions, for instance, by the government to oversee equity and health initiatives for her indigenous community. And the Arahuacos are not covered because it's not Quimbaya or San Agustin. But it also kind of raised the issue in my mind of it depends so much on also which indigenous community, right? So it's the Sierra Nevada that she, for instance, is from. And there's been a whole ecological and tourism and preservation of that area that may give those indigenous groups some purchase. They seem to have had it under the Santos government, for instance, that might not be accessible to a group like the Cauca indigenous groups, for whom land, and they've managed to recuperate 300,000 hectares, which is nothing to sneeze at, of old resguardo lands that had been invaded, taken, appropriated, etc. So even within the indigenous community, it matters which one, right? So whether Petro would take up the Quimbaya one depends a lot on how much this government is going to focus on culture when it has a range of much more. I'm not trying to diminish its importance, but things to deal with, like getting, for instance, all the armed groups, and now the announcement has been made that there will be formal peace talks with the ELN, dealing with the repercussions. And this is something I thought of reading your book, which came out, of course, and one has to give it to the publisher. I imagined it was probably in early 2021 before it comes out in 2022, that Colombia, which is not a country that has been notable except in certain pockets for popular outrage and demonstrations and organization, really did in April of 2020. Yeah, and it was huge, and perceived as very, very threatening by the Duque government, which Petro's government replaced. But it really, for some of us, it was sort of finally, going out to the streets and saying no more. And we don't care how, many people lost their eyes or were wounded, because the same thing that happened with the Chilean demonstrations, where the police aimed, for instance, at the eyes. And yet it didn't stop people from continuing to go out. And that was really, I would be interested in hearing but really unprecedented in my lifetime in the context of Colombia, and seemed a positive indication that people were fed up. And part of the election of Petro was very much that all of those people who have historically been marginalized, excluded, not recognized as a critical part of the Colombian national entity want to be acknowledged, are demanding that they be taken into account. Leaving aside whether one agrees with Petro or voted for whatever, it does represent a very different kind of approach and platform from what has been in existence. So maybe.
Yeah, I think, and I think I may have two answers to what you were saying. One is that, and I think I say that somewhere in the book, I haven't found like an obvious bias from left governments in the region in favor of these claims, as opposed to right-wing governments. You find occasionally, like López Obrador in Mexico, yes, has made more noise on the issue. But overall, I'm not sure that the political leaning of an incumbent president really determines whether he or she will be more active on this front. However, I do think that it matters in the case of Colombia, and that's what really I'm hearing now, for example, with the people in San Agustin, that I think that what they're really hoping for is that with Petro, they will be heard. And someone will talk to them. Because pretty much for the past 30 years, what they say is that the Ministry of Culture or the ICANN, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, these people don't talk to them. They have no interest in them. And they are, I think, if there may be a political change in Colombia, I think they're hoping that at least they can be heard, regardless of the result of their claim. And the second way of answering your comment, I would agree that the fate of the Quimbaya collection in particular is really, for me, it's really hard to predict that it would come back anytime soon. Specifically, and that's a difference that I found because European museums are mostly public museums. So any claim has to go to a government. The people at the, when I tried to talk at the Museum of America in Madrid, I tried to talk to them. They wouldn't talk to me. They don't care. They don't care. Their answer was like, call the Ministry of Culture. And so, they are really protected here. Like they are protected by their own government, which is not the case, for example, of North American museums. And I think that in part explains why the De Young in San Francisco or Yale, even though they are powerful, prestigious institutions of knowledge, at some point they had to make concessions. Public European museums at this point don't have to make this until, for example, in the case of Germany, there is a political decision coming from the highest levels in the state that makes this decision and establishes a new policy in favor of the returns. Who knows, that might happen in Spain one day, but the fate of the Kimbaya collection will depend on this and not on any goodwill at the very small level of that museum.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Mila Burns. I'm a professor at Lehman College and the associate director at the CLACOS. Thank you so much. This was amazing, and it's an honor to have this level of conversation here. I was thinking throughout this presentation about Julia Pastrana, the case of the Mexican 19th century singer and performer who had hypertrichosis and her body was the object of study in many places, ended up in Norway. And this Mexican-American artist, Laura Anderson Barbata, made it a crusade to repatriate her body. So I think it dialogues with the human remains aspect of that, but it's at the same time, like it's not someone who was a victim of political abuse or that people still think of or a hero. It was someone that this individual decided that mattered. And so she made a campaign basically and convinced the entire population in Sinaloa that she did matter, to the point that after years of negotiating, she basically alone managed to bring the body back. And there was a lot of movement among the community and so on and so forth. But the government in Mexico barely participated on that. They signed a few documents because she needed them to, and she was like bugging them to do that for months, years. But what I wanted to understand, and I think this is underlined throughout the conversation, is the aspect of nationhood and national identity overall. And I don't want to go full Jane Bennett here and talk about the agency of objects or anything, but to what extent these objects are also reinforming and reshaping the debate on national identity. And I cited Julia Pastrana because I do think that there was a reckoning with indigenous heritage and belonging and the abuse of women in Sinaloa. So to what extent they are also shaping the debate once they are returned or not returned?
I don't know if I believe in the agency of objects. I believe in the agency of people. I think that for me, that speaks to what cultural heritage is. That is a construction. So objects per se do not matter until they matter to someone, and that someone is ready to become a political entrepreneur and make what it takes to obtain these returns. But as you were saying, I don't think that the object itself has, or one body has more value than another body. It's what we in the present believe is important. And just as for indigenous communities, the remains of their ancestors can be important. Yeah, I can see how for a local community in Sinaloa, the body of their most distinguished artist could be something important, but it has to be constructed as such by someone.
So I'm going to put Marian, at any point you want to add, just say.
No, the only thing I was thinking earlier, but it kind of takes us a little bit away, is that, you know, in some of the debates here in the United States of Native communities requesting that the bodies of their ancestors be returned to them, it also has to do with the fact that they were, DNA sequencing has been done and scientific for reconstructing the genome, for instance. And the point that these communities will make is we were not asked about that. This is something that we needed to have been participants in. And while it's very different because it's a body, right? It does kind of align with some of what you were suggesting in the case of San Agustin. We wanted them to talk to us, right? It isn't, yes, it's the loss of the statues, but it's also that it indicates a larger refusal of the state to engage in and take and kind of invite the participation and recognize the rights of individuals to have a say over their culture and their surroundings. I mean, I think that that's the, yeah.
And especially, I think, in discourses over heritage, because there has been this tradition of discourses being constructed at a national level without necessarily allowing for more local narratives to gain this same kind of visibility and to be articulated with the larger discourse.
So So in the back.
Good night. I'm Oscar. I'm PhD student of Latin American history here at the Grad Center. Thank you for the Paul's presentation. I have a question. I found it very interesting, like in the different presentations, like how these return claims are linked to ideas of nationalism, indigeneity, like race, ethnicity, and all these kind of topics. And I wonder, like, what happened at the other side of the claim? Like, what kind of ideas are mobilized in European countries behind the idea of refusing or accepting these kind of claims? Like, why? You were mentioning like Germany tends to be like right now from your presentation like more open to that. Like I wonder like why is that the case? Like what difference you see between European countries and like how this kind of situation also speak to how European countries relate to their colonial past.
Well, I don't want to be really short-sighted in my answer, but I think that particularly since 2020, there has been a very huge movement in museums of like decolonizing the museum as an institution of knowledge. But again, I don't want to be short-sighted because this is definitely a movement that comes from further back. But I think the national situations depend in great part of how in-depth the conversations have gone within each national museum community. I think that in Germany, for example, the establishment of the Humboldt Forum generated these conversations, and this is an institution that has been in the making for like 10 or 15 years. So there was a lot of time and space for that kind of debates. I don't know the situation in Spain so well, but I could totally imagine how it has not taken place in the same way. And that in great part for me explains the, which is why like in a country like the UK, those conversations have taken place. I think that the noise that Dan Hicks' book about the Benin bronzes a year and a half ago, it was like a deflagration in the world of museums. And as a consequence, his own museum and other university museums are making these decisions, but those are, again, smaller museums that have decision levels that allow them to make these moves. You have currently, and I think here I would say I would see a much more direct political connection, but currently in the UK you have a very conservative government that absolutely refuses to engage in any form of reevaluation of the imperial glory of the UK. So that cannot transform into a change in policy at the national level for the biggest museums in the UK. Again, I think that can change very quickly, especially because I think the situation of the British Museum is almost ridiculous at this point. It's like the British Museum, it's its own little world out there in an ocean of museums where these conversations take place. And the British Museum cannot remain immune to these conversations for that much longer. So it will happen at some point. But yeah, I think it's a mix between like the different levels at which these conversations can take place. And now, I have some French friends here, and they know I don't like too much the French president at the time, so I'm just gonna take the opportunity to make this little comment and criticism. But he made a big splash back in 2017 by commissioning a report. The report was extremely ambitious. It's a quite beautiful document. The report came out in 2018, and since then, nothing has happened. Oh yeah, France did return a few objects to Benin and Senegal, but those objects would have been returned with or without the report and with or without the whole conversation. So yeah, those questions it's funny because it's at the same time a conversation that happens at the international level. And of course, museum professionals speak among each other, but there is still a very national component in those discussions, I think.
Yeah, I think I am even less optimistic than you in the way that a realization of the underlying assumptions of race and class and colonialism and Orientalism and et cetera are underlying assumptions in current holder countries about the way repatriation should happen. Like every time I hear, well, we have to make sure it's going to be safe if it gets sent back. It's like, what assumptions are you thinking? Like, have you gone and inspected the museums? I don't think so. Have you thought about the way that the history of suppression of expertise and like not allowing, say, Egyptian citizens to study Egyptology in the school that the Oriental Institute of Chicago set up in Egypt for a long time? Like there's a reason that states are different in their levels of preparedness, even if there is a difference, which isn't always the case. And those sort of I think those assumptions need to be examined much more heavily. And who gets to have the final say needs to be set. So you kept praising Germany. I'm definitely more down on this because you can say whatever you want, but until the plane takes off with the Benin bronzes on it, I will not be too optimistic because so many of these repatriation promises have been, yes, we'll give it all back just as soon as you build a museum that is exactly to our specifications and will cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're not going to fund that. No, that's up to you. You want it back? You got to fill this, in some cases, I think, impossible dream of what has to happen. And which is also to have the idea, like you demonstrate Yale having with the Machu Picchu idea, that the only acceptable place to hold these objects is in a Western museum, even if that Western museum is exported to another country. Whereas there are so many cultures where these objects are of religious use or some other entire system of meaning that is not going to look the same as a museum.
If I can just add on this, I really think that at this point, human remains are the only category of museum objects that may have a chance to escape their fate as museum objects. But an object returned from any Western museum will go to a museum.
That's not true.
You have examples from Nepal about this.
Yes.
You do. Okay, sorry.
Last year, I went to see the reinstallation into a shrine of a deity that was stolen from the shrine in 1984. And it was the first reinstallation into worship in Nepal, and it's been followed by others. So I think there is hope for an idea of escaping museum status, but it is indeed very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Hi, my name is Patricia Tovar. I'm an anthropologist, professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center and John Jay College. And if you want to see the Elgin marbles, they're downstairs at the lobby. Well, if you want to take a closer look to the copies. But I did work at the Colombian Instituto Colombiano de Antropología in Bogota for 10 years. From 1998 to 2006. And while I was there, we couldn't go to San Agustin. We couldn't go to Ciudad Perdida because of conflict, because not even, to pay the people who were guarding the area, they had to use helicopters from the police. It was very bad at the time. But then I saw repatriations, and I saw boxes and boxes of objects that were brought from the airport, so experts could take a look and see if they were authentic. So they were doing that. But as Mary mentioned, there are so many politics involved there, because the most important thing right now is the Galeon San Jose. the Galeon San Jose is this big, big sunk galleon off the coast of Cartagena that has objects from Peru, from Panama, from different countries, from Colombia, and it was on its way to Spain. So I remember that there were discussions on the government wanted to sell part of the treasure to collectors because they were saying, well, we don't need that many coins. We don't need, we just get a few and then we can sell the other ones. So that was the position of the government at the time. So, and that was the center of the discussions. And I think they appointed a director at ICANN just to deal with that. Now the things are still entangled there. And lately, I don't know what has happened with that, but that was an issue there in Colombia and a big one. See, and I wanted to say another thing. Is that some Mexican researchers went to Europe, went to a library and stole some codices from the library and brought them back to Mexico, and they became heroes in Mexico because they were trying to repatriate those codices, but they thought that the only way to do that was what they did, and they were successful.
He wasn't a researcher. It was
somebody. I remember the story. I don't know the details exactly, but that was one way of returning things to Mexico that they did. I don't know. But the other thing that I was going to say, when you mentioned also human remains, that's a problem in Colombia also, and many indigenous people have requested those remains to be removed from the Museo Nacional. But I was going to tell you, I don't know if you know Tony Hillerman. This is this indigenous writer, a novelist, and he has one of his books. He has won many prizes, and the American Anthropological Association has given him, all this recognition. And one of his books is about, well, it begins when the director of a museum, a famous museum, receives a box, and he opens the box and there are the remains of his grandparents that an indigenous group who was trying to get those remains out of that museum did to him. So I don't remember the exact title of that book, but that will be an interesting reading. But in addition to the remains, there are also the sacred bundles that many indigenous Native Americans have that they want to take out of those museums, and they're still trying to do. So that was my comment. Sorry if it was too long. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lidia Hernandez Tapia. I'm a PhD student in the Latin American, Iberian, and Latino Cultures Department here at the Graduate Center. The book seems fascinating, so congratulations. I have two questions. First, I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more about the legal frameworks in the European countries and also in the international context, whether there is any, like what is the legal framework, whether it addresses specifically these issues, right? And the second one has to do with the terms in which this returning the cultural objects has happened, and whether it has opened any conversation about reparations, or whether there is a bigger discussion about, not only returning the objects, but, the bigger, I don't know, like contributing to, I don't know, like funding or the question of reparation.
So on the legal aspect, if we look at the international level, 1970 is often considered like a watershed moment, because that's the year of the adoption of the UNESCO Convention on the restitution of cultural heritage objects. So basically, and here I'm going to speak under Erin's supervision, but let's say that a serious museum that would purchase today an object that was still in its country of origin by 1970 would, well, a serious museum would not do that, probably. Okay, or shouldn't do that, because this is really important. It is criticized on all sides of the debates. It's an imperfect text, but it exists. There are other conventions, and there are bilateral treaties between countries that are usually the basis for the legal aspect of the repatriation of objects. And then, of course, there is the laws of each country, whether and what they specifically stated at the time an object was removed. So that's like to answer your question on the legal aspect. Whether or not a return will come with some form of reparation, yes, it happens. So, for example, in the case of Yale, Yale paid for the entire shipping. Yale paid for the remodelation of the house where the collection is now housed in Cusco. Similarly, the Swedish part paid for, and they paid like a big quantity of money to like build big cases that would control the vibrations for the textiles during their transportation to Peru. And yes, it is considered by some as like an admission of guilt, that in a way we are going to pay for this as a way to make it up. Now, if I go back to, I don't remember right now, I think I know that, but like in the case of the Teotihuacan murals, I don't remember, but I think probably the museum may have paid for the shipping. I would have to check my notes on this. Then again, expanding beyond just the moment of the return, I think that when I speak to people in San Agustin, there's really this idea that beyond the moment of the return of a statue, what it is that what can we do, and what can the German museum help us do for our community based on this return. So if these statues return, hopefully they don't stay in Bogota, but they come back to us. But if they come back to us, what do we do with them? We don't have any kind of serious infrastructure to keep them, to explain them, to research them. And I think that a way of a reparation, as the people I speak to in San Agustin would expect, would be to help them set up this. And that connects me back to the question of trust, is that it's for me quite incredible that these people hope that the Germans would help them do that, because they don't believe that either ICANN or the Ministry of Culture would do that for them in their community, which I think really speaks to the level of mistrust that there is between a local level and a national institution.
Just to add that the legal situation is complex in the US, but it also doesn't really matter because the vast majority of repatriations have been over the last couple of decades voluntary. So the result of negotiations that had really nothing to do with the law and mostly happened if a museum violated its own stated acquisition guidelines. So since around 2008, but more reliably since 2016, museums in the US have usually said we will not acquire something if we don't know it was out of its country of origin before 1970. There's a lot of museums who are just like, ask no questions. It's no provenance, great. Just as long as we don't know for sure. And this is also just to share how like painfully stupid this is as a policy to me, because there's been no saying that, well, we need to look back at the things we already acquired to see if those violated or, were looted or smuggled out of their country of origin just since 2016 on, which to me is like saying, well, you can't murder people during the weekends. That's that's your free time. You know, if it's either wrong or it's not wrong, you can't just say like, let's call it a wash up until the last couple of years.
Kristen, can I ask you a question here? Would you say that some of the anger that's felt by some communities, for instance, taking the Yale cases that, I mean, even the museum in Berlin, these things were stored away and no one was really looking at them or studying them. And so this whole assertion on the part of these entities, well, we take care of them and we conserve them, and they're, you know, it's a way for the public to be able to have access and the scientific community to be able to study them in a way that they wouldn't be able to if they were sent back to their place of origin, is really empty.
In the case of the Machu Picchu collection, clearly, and it was funny because Yale actually published at some point a document to try and refute some of the arguments from the Peruvian side. And as they were doing this, it was like really an admission that they had done nothing with this collection for decades, because they published a list of their own publications. And they're like basically 3 articles in like the 1920s. And then until the mid 1980s, which is when the current curator came in, literally nothing happened. They were in storage somewhere in Yale for 60 years. In the case of the San Agustin statue, and that's what David Dellenbach, this US citizen, recounts, and I haven't heard anything different. He was, for a weird reason, he went to Berlin in 1992, if I remember well, and they let him go through the warehouses of the museum, which for me is like a crazy story that, like, seriously, can I just go to a museum and be like, hey, can I just walk around your warehouses? I should do that one day. Anyway, he says that he actually found some of those 35 statues that were like in sheets or something, and literally nobody had ever unpacked them, much less researched or displayed them for, I don't know, 70 or 80 years. So another one like this about the good care of the objects, that Clemencia Plazas, who used to be the director of the Museo del Oro in Bogota, told me that when she was like a PhD student, she did like a tour in Europe to try and evaluate like all the collection of Colombian gold in European museums. So she gets to the Museum of America, and the way she tells me the story is that when she got to Museum of America and she was like, can I see the Quimbaya collection? Someone just came with like arms full of objects and was just like, here they are. And this is how the Museum of America was taking care of that collection in the mid-70s. Arguably, things have changed, and I do not doubt for a second that they are now under like a much more careful.
Artifacts are being observed.
Yeah, and it probably. So you're right, like that invalidates in great part for the Penacho de Moctezuma. You hear stories about, so like allegedly you cannot bring it back to Mexico because it would not stand the vibrations on the plane. But then you have people telling you that there are like house music parties in the museum where like you hear the punchy that just make vibration on the floor of the museum where so with each of these cases you hear that kind of stories. I haven't heard that about the Paracas textiles in Sweden. Like everybody says that it was like top notch in Sweden, but anyway.
Julie, did you have your hand up? No, everybody, can you close it?
Hola, soy Mónica Carrillo de Perú. Felicitaciones por el libro. Y hablo en español porque sé que hablas español y todos. Estuve hace 2 meses en Colombia con un grupo de abogados afrodescendientes que están siguiendo el caso de San Galeón. Y uno de los retos y preguntas es, bueno, en caso de venderse parte de eso, ese dinero se va a usar para políticas de reparación específica para indígenas, y de ser así, ¿cómo lo afrodescendiente entra a tallar? Por una cuestión tal vez de territorialidad, porque es Colombia, o tal vez por un tema que es algo poco discutido, el cual es el rol de los esclavizados, especialmente especialistas orfebres que fueron llevados de África y que trabajaron de la mano con indígenas,
tanto para extraer oro y plata, pero también para producir. Entonces tenemos 400 años de producción orfebre que no necesariamente a veces es recordada, y muchos de esos objetos han salido y también se están planteando el recuperar. Entonces quería saber si tenías alguna experiencia, comentario sobre eso. Hace 2 semanas estuve en el Museo de Machu Picchu y fui al Museo Inca, al Museo Machu Picchu, y uno de los retos que vi en el Museo Machu Picchu a partir de mis conversaciones era, bueno, llegaron los objetos repatriados de Yale, pero había mucha expectativa de la propia gente, de los turistas, que llegara oro. Y la gente dice, ¿dónde está el oro que se llevaron? Y en términos de sostenibilidad de un museo de esas características, que no tiene el oro del Museo Inca, el gran reto es que el Estado no ha desarrollado una infraestructura de museos, porque también muchas de las cosas han estado fuera. Entonces no es suficiente arreglar una casa y dar un apoyo técnico por un año. Y ahí va mi segunda pregunta. ¿Hay alguna política, propuesta, experiencia en la cual este tipo de devoluciones se acompañen también con una reparación o un acompañamiento económico por largo plazo? Porque no hay infraestructura, entonces terminan siendo administrados por universidades públicas que no tienen dinero, porque obviamente el Estado tampoco da dinero para ello. Bueno, gracias.
Not in order. Gold in Machu Picchu. So actually that was part of Yale's arguments, that there never was gold in their collection, which is very likely, because most likely by 1911, when Hiram Bingham got to Machu Picchu, all the gold that was there had already been taken by other people, possibly by the Incas themselves when they retreated from Machu Picchu, and what was left had probably been looted by other people before that. So there never was much gold in that collection. Yes, of course, and this is really actually part of the arguments of the people who are against this kind of returns, to say that, okay, we're going to bring these objects back, and what is going to happen to them for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, because if there is not an institution with the political will and the financial resources to do something with it, then these objects are just going to sit there, which, as far as I understand, is very much the case with the Machu Picchu collection there. And there, that collection may in part be the victim of the kind of political games that I'm talking about in my book, where it was important for Peruvian presidents to make a show of it, and they wanted this collection, yes, they wanted it now, and it didn't really matter what would happen to the collection once it would be back. What mattered is that it was back. The specific case of Colombia, I don't know. But yes, I mean, to the question of reparations, I don't think I understand how selling something to pay for reparations really helps the case. But I don't know. For me, it's bizarre to enter into fights to obtain objects. Well, in that case, to bring it back from under the sea, to sell it sounds like such a narrow-sighted vision of what could be done with it. But I'm not sure I have a very set opinion on this.
Yes, my name is Barney Freeman. I'm a guest here. I just wondered, I want to ask all the panelists, if you think it would be useful or even feasible to set up an international court to adjudicate these disputes.
There is something.
Yeah, UNESCO has something that's supposed to be used for disputes and has only actually been used once, twice.
Because both parties have to agree.
Exactly.
It's like the International Court of Criminal Justice, the US, I mean, and Central America, and it's fine. Nicaragua will,
So
the US won't.
Actually, there have been talks, and I think the UK recently agreed to have the case of the marbles examined by that committee, which is kind of surprising. And I know that, for example, in the Kimbaya case, it has been argued in Colombia that this dispute could go in front of this committee, and Spain said, nope, we're not going to discuss it in that forum. Supposedly they are discussing it bilaterally, but here again, I'm not sure the state of the negotiation. So this kind of instrument exists, but it really, as long as states are the main actors in international politics, then it depends on the goodwill of states to bring these conversation into those larger forums, and otherwise it will remain at a bilateral.
Yeah, and this thing, whatever it is, I feel bad. I totally wrote part of an article about it, but do I remember the details? No. Doesn't have any like enforcement teeth, right? It can give recommendations, but what are you going to do after that?
ICPRCP, International Committee, Repatriation, and anyway, it's a UNESCO little thing, but it's just not.
The problem also is with international organizations, whose interest is it to create something like this? And if we're talking about there was a wealth and power imbalance, serious one, between those who are claiming and those who are holding. Hard to imagine there being kind of the balance of power that would create. But that's just so simple. International. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or ask? I think this has been wonderful. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. We will also now go downstairs to room 5419 for wine and pretzels.
Yes.